Hi there, this is Hot Pocket Remix, and in this video I'm going to give you an overview of the Dark Souls event scripting system. In order to understand the event scripting system in Dark Souls, I first need to give you some idea about what an event even is. Is opening a door an event? How about picking up an item, talking with an NPC, or even just swinging your sword? To answer this, I thought the best way to show what an event is to remove them from the game. It'll be easy to notice what's missing and what's not. So I've started a new game, sat at this first bonfire, and then deleted all the event scripts. So let's see what's different. The first thing you'll probably notice is that the bonfire I'm standing at does not appear lit. The kindling level of bonfires is controlled by an event script. That's not so interesting though, so let's continue on. You'll immediately notice a few things are a little off compared to what you're used to. For one thing, the Asylum demon isn't waiting on the roof to surprise us, and he has no boss health bar. You can also walk out of the fight at any time. However, I'm still able to move around, throw black fire bombs, and kill enemies. The two hollows that only appear when you return to the asylum are here. The gate to the exit is already closed. I'm going to have to use Cheat Engine to glitch myself through it. Ah, a bonfire. Let's light it and sit down, shall we? The problems with bonfires aren't just visual, as you can see. Now, you can tell by my character's armor that I'm a pyromancer. But looking at the items that we have to grab, there's a few more items than the pyromancers here. In fact, the items for every class are here. The game doesn't swap out the items depending on what class you are, but instead they're all always here. It just disables them all except for the ones appropriate for your class. Now, unfortunately, we have a bigger problem up ahead, the Black Knight. Fortunately, I've given myself just the tool we need, and we have plenty of shields. The event that disables the enemies that you meet when you return to the asylum is no longer running, so the Black Knight is here no matter what. This fog wall is no longer passable, so I'll have to cheat my way through it again. And we have quite the sight on the other side. 2 Oscars. And no way to reach them, unfortunately, since the ball that normally smashes open this room isn't feeling up to it, even with 2 hollows to give it a push. So, again, I'll cheat myself into this room. One Oscar isn't very talkative, and the other isn't kind enough to actually give us any items. He doesn't die, though. The dying Oscar normally has very little health, but you can see here that he actually has the normal amount of health. It's just later reduced by an event script so that he dies in one hit if you choose to kill him on your first trip through the asylum. The other Oscar's AI isn't turned on, so he doesn't put up much of a fight. He still drops his item, however, since it's not handled by an event script. I might as well end this exploration here. There's not much remaining that we haven't seen. However, if I dark sign, we do notice something else different. The game no longer knows that the Asylum Demon is a boss, so he'll respawn every single time. Now there's a whole lot more to see if we went through the rest of the game, but I'll leave that to you. Now that we've seen what events are and are not, we can look at the game files that code them. Now, in my opinion, there are two main reasons to look at these files. Number one, we can understand Dark Souls on a technical level more than we currently do. The motivation for this project was not sparked by modding or anything like that, but instead because Illusory Wall mentioned on Reddit that he was looking into when certain event flags were being set, and I wanted to see if I could find out more. Looking at these files allows us to determine exactly how a fragment of the game works, and also opens up avenues of exploration that might allow us to decode even more in the future. The second reason is we can make mods for the game. Because I now know how these files work, I've developed tools that allow us to modify the events and repack them into a form the game can interpret, thus adding new content to the game. The current mods for Dark Souls that most people are familiar with are texture replacements or text replacements. And while these are very powerful and certainly took a lot of effort to develop tools for, I think many players view them as purely cosmetic adjustments. With event scripts, we can get closer to modifying the game in the way that players expect mods to work, and perhaps even add new content or modify existing content. And in a future video, I'll explain how to make a small mod that adds something new, if very simple, to the game. So, I've got some files open here, and I'm currently in the unpacked data for Dark Souls, looking in the event directory. And you can see that there's a bunch of files here, and they're emevs and emelds and so on. The files we're interested in are emevs. These are event scripting files. There's one for each area in the game. That's what these map signifiers mean. And also common, which runs in every area of the game. Since emeved files are packed binary data, I've written some tools to work with them so you don't have to use a hex editor to work with the files directly. So what I've done is I've taken the file for the Undead Asylum, which is M1801, and I've put it in a temporary directory here, and I've unpacked it from the .dcx format, which is a compression format. That may not be necessary in the future if we can find a tool that unpacks the Dark Souls files into just the emeved format without the .dcx, but I'm not going to go into that right now. So we have this .emeved file, and I want to look at it not through a hex editor, so I develop some tools. And one of those tools takes that data and just puts it in a more readable format, something that you can look at. It's still numeric data, but we can more easily inspect it and definitely easier edit it. So this is the file for the Undead Asylum. And it's still not easy to look at, but certainly easier than binary data. So I've also added some additional structure to these files. We don't want to just see a bunch of tables or anything like that. So I've added some commas and so on, all these other things, and grouped things appropriately, put some indentations in, etc. But ultimately, this is more or less the data in the original file, just in a slightly different order. I claim that these are event script files, but they don't look anything like a scripting language. So how can I be sure? Well, for one thing, I figured this out, so I do know for sure. But if you were just looking at this, you might think this is texture data or something like that. It's not necessarily clear that this is a scripting language. So how would we figure this out? Well, in fact, there is a file in that data directory that we didn't talk about, and it's the emedf file. And the emedf file is actually a developer documentation file that was left inside the archives that we unpacked. Presumably, it was put there by accident. So once I figured out what this file was, it turns out to be key for understanding these emedf files. I've taken common.emedf and I've unpacked it. It uses a different format, so this unpacker that I wrote won't work on it, but I have a different unpacker that does. And I will, of course, put the unpacked version up on the internet so that people can look at it without needing a specialized unpacker. But you can see the unpacked version here. And it basically tells us that each one of those lines is a command. And it gives a short description. Here I'm just looking at one in particular in Japanese. And some description of what each of the arguments are, again in Japanese. And I've tried to at least provide some pretty bad, in most cases, but hopefully reasonable translations into English here so that you can understand what each command does. So if we come back here, we can see that, say, we have command 2009-03. And so if we find command 2009, there's 2009 for the class and 3 for the index. This is the command that registers a bonfire, whatever that means. Now, by the way, I don't think that the developers of Dark Souls would be working with this version of the file if they were programming it and constantly consulting the emedf. Instead, they would almost certainly have a specialized tool that lets them view it more closely to the translated versions here that then writes out this numeric version behind the scenes. We don't have that specialized tool, though, so for us, for making a mod, this is the most convenient one to work with. But I won't get into that right now. There will be future videos talking about how to work with this format in making a mod. I should also mention that some of these commands make reference to certain enums, and by default these are actually in the emedf, not a separate file. But I've separated what the enums are into a separate file so you can just look through them without having it cluttering up the description here, because a lot of the enums are duplicated. If you're a programmer, you're probably already familiar what I mean by enum, but if not, hopefully it's clear. It's just a value that means something in particular. Now, if we return to the numeric version, of course, we could go back and forth and look up what every single command is and what all the arguments mean. But for a file like this, which is already quite long, that would take a very, very long time. So instead, I've added a part to the tools that I've developed to print out a prettier version of each command using the information from the emedf. Now, as much as I'd like to use the pretty version when developing mods, it's pretty non-standard for what each command looks like, and so it's pretty hard to actually parse back into, say, this format. So that's the reason why I'm not parsing that and why we're not modding using that version instead. We'll mod use this version. Here's what that looks like for that same file, but now I've written it out as the verbose version, this pretty version. And you can see it's actually now somewhat understandable. And so again, if we go to the top Now, the first command really is register bonfire, etc., etc. Just because it's far more readable doesn't necessarily mean that it's obvious what anything really does here. So to that end, I've selected this particular event here, and we're going to look at it in slightly more detail. It's not necessarily going to clear everything up. I still have questions myself, plenty of questions about how these things work, but hopefully it will give you some idea of how these event scripts actually work. So with that in mind, what are we looking at here? Well, we have an event ID, so every event has a unique numeric identifier. In this case, it's 118103112. And in some way, this is the name of the event. Some ways more literally than others. If you look in the event directory, there's also EMELD files. And EMELD files are also documentation files. They're not needed to run the game. And they actually contain this data. This one is the EMELD file for the Northern Undead Asylum, same file. And it contains basically just a table of event IDs and descriptions. And of course, the descriptions are in Japanese, but I've translated the one we're interested in using Google Translate, and it translates to something roughly like escape from the boss room. So if we return here, this event is talking about something to do with escaping from the boss room. And it turns out this event is, of course, exactly that. It's the event that lets you run away from the asylum demon if you don't want to fight it on your first encounter. You run past it through that little portcullis to the second bonfire, and the portcullis closes behind you, and so on. This is the event responsible for handling all that. Now, there's also this int here. I would give a better description if I knew exactly what this int does, but unfortunately I don't. I think it has something to do with when the event is automatically restarted or automatically terminated. I'm not exactly sure what it does. It's either 0, 1, or 2, and I'll talk more about that in my video about modding, but for right now, if somebody wants to figure that out, that would be great, but for right now, we can ignore it. This event takes no parameters. And again, I will talk more about what parameters are in another video, but for right now, it's something like you can submit additional data to the event to be included in these commands when you initialize it. And this one has nothing. It's always going to do the exact same thing. What are we looking at here? Well, this has 12 different commands, and they execute in order, one after the other. And there's some things about skipping lines and so on that we're not seeing here. There are commands to do that. But importantly, there's no for loops, no real if statements or anything like that. This is a very non-standard programming language. It's very high level. It seems like whenever they needed a command, they went in and made a command. There are no commands, for example, of figuring out how many souls the player has, or at least none that I'm aware of. But there is a command to tell if the player is using a skull lantern or another source of light, because, for example, in the Tomb of the Giants, holding a skull lantern or another source of light will cause certain things to happen. It seems like it's a very ad hoc thing of what commands exist and what don't, which is kind of unfortunate when we're looking at making mods, because we have to work with what's already given, and sometimes things are missing. But for this particular event, let's take a closer look at what each of the instructions do. So the first 4 are actually all connected to one another. They set up what is called a condition group. And I refer to them here as registers and so on, which is maybe slightly misleading. But what this is doing is saying, okay, the execution of the program cannot continue until the main register is true. This is how it always works. When is the main register true? Well, this last line here says when register and O1 is true. There are several different registers. There's and registers and or registers, And registers need everything that's loaded into them to be true. So that's the previous 3 lines. What is loaded into the AND register? The first one is that this event flag 16 is off. The next one is that event flag 11810315 is on. And finally, this command is the player standing on hitbox entity ID 1813120. So we need to know some more about map data and other things in order to figure out what all those things are. And really, it's the event scripting files that help us determine what event flags are, although other people, in particular Illusory Wall, have figured out what a lot of event flags do without knowing anything about these event scripts, which blows my mind that people are able to figure out so much without being able to see the source code, but here we are. Event flag 16 is actually that the Asylum Demon is dead, so it's off, which means the Asylum Demon must be still alive for this to continue. And 11810315 is actually a flag that is set when we fight the Asylum Demon for the first time. When we first open that door and run through and have the option of running off into the side. Now, I don't mean literally the first time, but I mean we're not coming back around and doing the plunge attack and so on. And finally, we have, is the player standing on this hitbox? Well, I don't know exactly where this hitbox is or what it looks like, but from context, it's the hitbox of the floor just past that little portcullis where we pass through to the second bonfire if we're running away from the Asylum Demon. So if all those 3 things are true, if you are fighting the boss, if it's the case that you are fighting it for the first time, and if you are just past that little portcullis, then execution can continue. So the first thing that happens is set the event flag that we were just talking about on line 1 here to off. So we're no longer fighting the boss for the first time. And we set this other event flag on. I'll come back to that in a bit, but it's a similar command. Okay, what is this command? This looks suspicious. It says object act activation, and then we've got some other things. One important thing is this entity ID. And if we go and look in the map data, this entity ID is the gate that you open when you leave the first bonfire and meet the Asylum Demon for the first time. So what is this doing? Well, it's saying that this entity should disable its object action. And entities sometimes have object actions, which are things that happen when you go up and press A on them. And this is saying turn that off, which is to say don't let the door be opened again, which makes sense. We know this is what happens. Okay, the next line says set player respawn point to this point. And again, we'd have to look in the map data to figure out exactly where this point is, but you can tell from testing that this point is actually just the second bonfire. Which means, if you think about what we've learned so far, if you fight the Asylum Demon for the first time and run away, as soon as you get past that gate, if you dark sign or somehow manage to kill yourself, you won't respawn at the first bonfire, you'll respawn at the second bonfire, even though you may not have lit it yet. So that's something kind of interesting to learn. I mean, it's maybe not obvious that this happens, but we can tell that it does, and you can go off and test this. We can tell that this happens from this event script. Okay, so then there's a save request, which just causes the game to save. And I'm going to skip the lines 9 and 11 for right now, talking about hitboxes, so we can talk about line 10 here, which forces entity ID 1811115 to play an animation. So this line forces entity ID 1811115 to play an animation. Now you can look in the map data to figure out that that entity is the gate, the little portcullis that closes behind you when you run away from the Asylum Demon for the first time. It's saying, okay, play the animation, and the animation is the closing animation. This is the line that's responsible for closing that gate behind you. And you can see some of these things make sense. It does not loop. It doesn't constantly close over and over again. It just plays it once. And then wait for completion true. This is very important. We don't want to continue on until the gate is all the way closed. And wait for transition or do not wait for transition here is something to do with animations that I don't necessarily quite understand. So I'm not going to talk about it right now, but I think it has something to do with how the animation is put into the animation queue. What is this hitbox command? Well, I can't be too sure because I think this entity ID determines an entity that's actually invisible, so it's kind of hard to tell what it is or where it is. But I believe it's actually an invisible wall, basically, over where the gate closes. In other words, you pass through it as you walk by the gate. So what I think happens here is as soon as this happened, the gate starts to close. That's line 10 here. Now, if we didn't have these hitbox commands, what could happen is, well, the gate starts to close and the player rolls underneath the gate, right? The gate is on its way down. Its hitbox does not extend all the way to the ground yet, so it's possible that the player can manage to roll under the gate. And they didn't want this to happen. So instead, there's this invisible wall entity that as soon as the gate starts to move, in fact, slightly before the gate actually starts to move, because that's this command. But as soon as the gate starts to move, the hitbox of this invisible wall is turned on. So now you can't run backwards or roll underneath the gate. It won't let you. And then the entity plays this animation, the gate closing animation, and the wait for completion here is important. We don't want to disable the hitbox until the animation is completed. Once the animation is done, then we can safely disable this invisible wall hitbox because the gate itself will prevent the player from leaving. They can't roll through it. It's a solid object. So that's basically all that happens in this event. So what happens is, as soon as the player runs past this gate, as long as the conditions are met, the door to the entrance no longer works, and the little portcullis closes behind them. That's all it looks like it's happening, but here's the code for it, basically. Now, I said I'd talk a little bit more about this line that talks about setting this event flag on, and I will right now. And you'll notice that this event flag ID is actually the same as the event ID up here. Same number. What does that mean? What this means is we're prematurely telling other events that this event has actually ended. When you reach the end of an event, unless there's a restart command or something like that, the event flag with the same number as the event ID will be turned on. So as soon as we get here, you could imagine there's another line here that just always says set event flag 11810312 to on, but it's implicit. It's not actually there. We need this extra command so that if other events are looking for this event flag to be on, in other words, for this event to be finished, they see that happening here rather than after the whole animation plays. And this is important for other reasons. One of those is if you save and quit the game while the animation is happening and load back in, we want other events to believe that the event has truly fully completed, even though the event was in the middle of playing. The event will not have completed at that time, and it would have to do this check again, and maybe the player is now no longer standing on this hitbox or something else. For example, this flag is automatically turned off, so this condition will no longer be true. So something could go wrong here, and so they just made it so that other events now believe that this event is complete. So that's all that's happening here. It's just doing this prematurely to make sure that other events believe this. This event is relatively simple. You can see that obviously a lot of work goes into figuring out exactly what needs to be done for any given event. And so because of that, a lot of work on our part needs to go into figuring out what all these event flags are, what exactly these commands do, etc. So I think that's all I want to say about the event scripting thing for now. I'm going to put up some other videos about how to actually do modding, since I know that that's something particularly interesting with these. How to actually use this numeric file and this verbose file and these tools to actually create new content or modify existing content or figure out what you want to do with the game, I will put up some separate videos about that.